Daniel James Morcom and his twin brother Bradley, along with their older brother Dean, were born to Bruce and Denise, living in the quiet town of Palm Woods on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. Bruce often spoke of Daniel's generous spirit and genuine care for others. The family was tightly knit, and Bruce noted that, while Daniel was shy with strangers, he was lively and full of energy around his family. Known for his good manners, punctuality, and behavior, Daniel was a joy to his parents. He loved being outdoors, spending time with animals, and playing with his brothers. His dream was to become a vet. His family described their life as simple and easygoing. On Sunday, December 7th, as darkness fell, Daniel's family grew anxious when he didn't return home by around 4:15 p.m. They asked his brothers, who had been out with friends, but none had seen him that day. Denise decided to walk to the bus stop. On her way, she noticed a broken-down bus being towed but found no sign of Daniel. She called the bus company, which confirmed that no one matching Daniel's description had boarded that day. The police were contacted shortly after 7:30 p.m. By the following day, the first images of Daniel appeared in the media, and a search began with police, up to 50 state emergency volunteers, and rescue helicopters scouring the area. But nothing turned up. We're scouting the area, but nothing turned up. His brothers spoke of how upset they felt that Daniel had asked them both to go shopping with him that day. But both having plans, they said no. The search quickly began to widen, with waterways and dams being explored too. Police divers were combing through the waters and volunteers were searching the grassland. It really was all hands on deck to try and find Daniel Morcom. The outpouring of help and support from the community was huge. Daniel's parents and brothers soon joined about 400 people to attend a vigil. Denise and Bruce quickly became regular faces in the media. Over the coming days, they were constantly appealing for help and making sure Daniel's face and details were being widely circulated. 2 weeks later was a particularly painful day for the family. December 19th would mark Daniel's 14th birthday. Authorities decided to create a reenactment, hoping to jog any memories from any motorists on the road that day. Several witnesses came forward. Some said they had seen Daniel that day, waiting near the bus stop, bored, and drawing pictures in the mud with a stick to keep himself occupied. Others reported seeing him stood near a man who was leaning against the wall behind him. He was described as gaunt, with a tattoo and a goatee, and this was corroborated several times. Just after 2:10, Daniel was no longer stood in the bus stop. Using the time frames they all provided, it was concluded that Daniel disappeared in an incredibly small 90-second window. A life-size clay model of the man seen near Daniel that day was placed in the same spot where he had disappeared, as well as a model of Daniel. And within just a few days, over 300 tips came in, tips that included reports of a suspicious white car circling the area that afternoon. As March 2004 came around, over 3,000 calls had been logged by Crime Stoppers, more than any other case in its history. Over the next few months, more and more events were held to try and raise awareness. Over 50 printing companies rallied together to produce almost 2 million leaflets about Daniel. Milk bottles with his face on it were also dispensed. And by October that year, more than 8,000 calls providing tips had been made. A $250,000 reward was announced, the biggest in Queensland's history. 2005 was soon here. As this year was a big one for Bruce and Denise, with their son still missing, they founded the Daniel Morcom Foundation. It was initially started as a way to draw more attention to their missing son's case, but it soon became so much more. They started offering support to educators, parents, and carers, and providing resources and education packs to help raise awareness about child safety. Months would soon turn into years, and despite the almost 10,000 tips that had been lodged, Daniel was still gone. Each year, his pictures would circulate the media, and the foundation would continue to keep his name alive. But despite the leads, police were still lacking in a lot of evidence. At one point, they had more than 500 persons of interest on their radar, but again, not enough to pull anyone in. 4 years would soon have passed. The Morcom family, who had been in the same house since Daniel's disappearance, obviously still hoping one day he might come home, made the tough choice to move. All of his belongings were just as he had left them that day, completely untouched. His parents made the difficult decision to pack up their family home and relocate elsewhere. Bruce and Denise had been following up on every tip that came their way, no matter how far it led them. Bruce even started his own covert operation, interviewing sex offenders in the area that claimed they had information. Nothing came of any of it, and the lot was nothing more than a hoax. The more time that passed, the more everyone feared that Daniel would never be found, and the case would never reach a conclusion. But Bruce and Denise weren't giving up. They soon called for an inquest into his disappearance, hoping that the lengthy list of persons of interest would be looked into once more. The inquest was granted and called the bus driver who didn't initially stop, and the people who had seen the man in question hanging around near Daniel, as well as a number of persons of interest. Thousands of pages of investigation were delivered to the state coroner. It was now sadly believed that Daniel had been killed shortly after being abducted, and authorities confirmed that they were now likely looking for his remains. One person that was asked to come and answer questions under oath was a father of three, 41-year-old Brett Peter Cowan. Brett was known to police and had actually been on their radar since the start. He was even interviewed just 2 weeks after Daniel went missing, and police admitted there were holes in his alibi from the beginning. Brett was not only close to the area at the time, but he had a string of shocking convictions, including several counts of sexual abuse against young boys. But after this, their attention had turned to another convicted sex offender named Douglas Jackway. As Brett entered the courtroom, however, Bruce and Denise recalled they took a sharp intake of breath. Denise said she turned to Bruce and said, "That's him. I know that's him." Brett was asked a series of questions, and the answers became more and more shocking. Dennis said that one of the most shocking of all was Brett stating there was no way he could have abducted Daniel, as he liked 6 to 8-year-old boys, and Daniel was far too old for him. Brett's list of offenses soon came to light in the courtroom. In 1987, a 7-year-old boy called Tim in Brisbane became Brett Peter Cowan's first known victim. Tim was at his usual daycare center, which happened to be where 18-year-old Brett would work and help out. One day, Brett tried to lure him into the bathroom, but Tim refused to go. Brett then, brazenly, grabbed Tim and forced him into one of the cubicles. Tim was subjected to a brutal and sustained sexual assault before Brett started strangling him, telling him he would kill him if he ever told anyone. It only stopped when one of the daycare workers called Tim's name out. Tim believes that if she hadn't come looking for him at that moment, he probably would have died. He said that although he survived the horrific ordeal, he still feels like Brett took his life that day. Brett was placed under arrest for the attack on Tim, but was given bail and went on the run for 2 years, eventually being found in New South Wales. Young Tim found the courage to testify against him in court and recalled that Brett was just sat smiling at him as if the whole thing was a game. Brett was sentenced to 2 years for the crime, but served less than 1 year before being let out. He moved to Darwin and told people he was a reformed Christian and had found God. Just a short while later, however, he viciously attacked another child. He snatched a 6-year-old from a trailer park, raped him, then left him for dead in the boot of a burnt-out car. Incredibly, the child managed to get out and stumbled to a petrol station for help. His collarbone was broken, one of his lungs was punctured, and his eyes were hemorrhaging from the suffocation he had been subjected to. Brett was eventually caught and sentenced to 7 years. He served 4. Brett's Peter Cowan underwent multiple psychiatric examinations, and one of the psychologists who had assessed him said he was a pathological liar with mild psychopathy and a severe lack of empathy. His crimes against young children were so depraved and caused such unimaginable trauma to them, it would only be a matter of time until he struck again. As his day in court, answering questions in regards to Daniel's case drew to a close, Brett looked at Bruce and Denise in the eyes and said, "I had nothing to do with Daniel's disappearance. Nothing at all." After witnessing Brett's answers and armed with a new task force, the investigation into Daniel's case took a swift turn. An extensive and complex undercover investigation got underway, one that would last 4 months with the hope of being able to prove that Brett was Daniel's abductor and likely killer. Brett's code name was P7. Authorities were using something called the Mr. Big technique. This technique involves creating a fictitious crime group and using undercover officers, The aim is to lure the suspect into the confidence of the fake criminal group. As the suspect in their mind moves further up the ranks, they eventually meet Mr. Big, the fake kingpin of the group. But this person is actually a police interrogator who will often offer them some sort of higher position in the group if they pass an interview. The hope is that during the interview, the suspect will bear all and confess to everything they've done. An undercover police officer claiming to be part of the fake gang befriended Brett as he was on a plane to Perth, and the operation was now in full swing. The officer said he wanted to introduce Brett to a powerful criminal gang with the promise of big money. Brett was hooked on the idea straight away. Over the next few months, Brett was gradually allowed to feel more and more involved in the group. He was dealing drugs for them, collecting fake debts, and buying and selling weapons. Finally, Brett was told the gang thought he was ready to meet the man at the top. This man was of course a highly skilled interrogator and likely had one shot at getting the answers everyone was searching for. The hotel room was rigged with cameras and a long interview got underway. To everyone's surprise, it didn't take long for Brett to start talking. Knowing that Daniel wouldn't be getting on a bus anytime soon, he parked his vehicle in a car park nearby. Brett then went and stood behind Daniel, pretending to wait for the bus as well, watching everyone around him and making sure it was relatively clear the whole time. As the second bus went past, Brett saw his chance. Daniel was then driven 30 minutes away to a secluded and desolate farm. His dad said he must have known he was in serious trouble and couldn't imagine the fear his son must have felt as he saw the roads get narrower and the area became less and less like the one he knew. Denise reiterated this and said, "When he was a little boy, he used to get scared at night and come and sleep on the floor next to our bed." Brett then parked up and Daniel was taken into a house. Daniel was killed within an hour of being abducted, according to Brett's submission and the opinion of experts and police. After this, Brett dragged his body down an embankment and threw his clothes into a creek. Following this startling and blunt confession, the undercover officers convinced Brett to take them to where he had dumped Daniel's body, under the pretense of helping him remove anything incriminating. They headed to a location 70 kilometers north of Brisbane. With police hiding in the bushes, they waited for Brett to walk further and further into the woods. This was the moment the team had been waiting for. Officers took Brett into custody, where he was charged with murder, abduction, deprivation of liberty, indecent treatment of a child under 16, and interfering with a corpse. A week later, in the area that Brett led them to, a trainer was found. This was followed by some shorts, a belt, and some destroyed underwear. Then 3 human bones were discovered. Using DNA from Daniel's toothbrush, it was confirmed that these were the bones of Daniel Morecambe. The complete search would take 3 months, and 17 bones in total were found. It would take just over a year for Daniel's remains to be released to his parents so they could finally bury him. And this came almost 9 years after he had disappeared. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral, and the community were out in force to show their love for the family. Daniel's disappearance had fast become one of the most extensively investigated crimes in Queensland's history, and everyone was saddened. It had come to such an awful end. Brett Peter Cowan's identity had been hidden by a name suppression, but a court order led to this being revoked at the request of Daniel's parents. Bruce said the minute Brett was arrested, it all made sense. Brett had been standing out since the inquest because of his history. Bruce recalled, "I felt he was a remarkably simple person to identify, and this was a simple puzzle to solve. He had a huge hole in his alibi and a disgraceful record. The initial officers who interviewed him were aware of the deficiency in his alibi, but it was never run out." Brett's Peter Cowan pleaded not guilty to the abduction and murder of Daniel Morecambe. Over the 1-month trial, 116 witnesses and more than 200 exhibits were admitted into evidence. Brett himself declined to give any evidence, still denying any wrongdoing. Over a decade after Daniel had been abducted and killed, the jury had reached a decision. On March 14, 2014, Brett Peter Cowan was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 20 years. As most expected, he sat emotionless as the verdict was read out. This finally brought an end to the biggest police investigation in Queensland's history and the biggest missing persons case in Australia's history at the time. Denise said, As the verdict was read out, she remembered the promise she had made to her son that she would get justice for him, and was so relieved that they had done it. She said, as a family, they never broke promises, and the first thing she wanted to do was pay him a visit and let him know they didn't let him down. Brett appealed his sentence, but this was flatly denied. Just the same as the public feel, Brett is loathed by his other inmates, and he has since faced several brutal attacks in prison. He remains incarcerated at Walston Correctional Center. One source inside said, he is respectful to officers, but that is more because he knows we are the only thing that stands between him and the other prisoners. Bruce and Denise spent almost a decade throwing themselves into campaigning and searching for answers. And Denise said that when Brett was sentenced, she finally felt like she was able to take a moment, go through Daniel's belongings, and sort out everything she had been compartmentalizing for so long. The case of Daniel Morecambe changed child safety in Australia, and the determination and dedication of his parents and family inspired the nation. The work of the Daniel Morecambe Foundation has been extraordinary. Bruce and Denise want the foundation to give back to the community, who had supported them from the day that Daniel went missing. The Daniel Morecambe Foundation is one of the most well-known and not-for-profit child safety organizations in all of Australia. Every year, thousands of people dress up in red to reflect the color he was last seen wearing for an annual National Day of Action for Child Safety. This is held on the last Friday in October and is known as Day for Daniel. It is Australia's largest child safety education and awareness day. Day for Daniel begins with a 4-kilometer walk, symbolizing the walk Daniel was never able to take to get home that day. Parents, carers, and educators are encouraged to start conversations with children and young people about personal safety. Schools and early learning centers conduct activities, and businesses and communities come together to raise awareness. Bruce and Denise also met with Tim, Brett's first known victim, to let him know that Brett would never hurt anyone again. Daniel's twin brother Bradley honored him at his wedding, with his older brother and best man Dean, carrying photos of him so he too could be part of the big day. After this, Bradley welcomed a baby boy. His middle name is Daniel. Daniel's older brother Dean also welcomed a little girl, and she was even born on the same day that Day for Daniel was held. The family still lay a seat for him at the Christmas table every year, with his photo by his chair, and his family makes sure that his name will continue to help people and never be forgotten. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Mandy Steingasser loved spending time outdoors with her father, Richard, often going on fishing and camping trips together. On one camping trip, she picked up a ground squirrel for a cuddle, only to be bitten in response. This wasn't out of character for Mandy. When she encountered snakes on other trips, she would pick them up and pet them rather than shy away. These experiences highlighted Mandy's personality. She was brave, had a love for animals, and wasn't deterred by their perceived dangers or flaws. Her loyalty extended to people as well. She had a diverse group of friends and remained devoted to each of them. If anyone questioned her choice of friends, Mandy would simply say that they were important to her, and that was what mattered most. In the fall of 1993, 17-year-old Mandy was a senior at North Tonawanda High School outside of Buffalo, New York. She did not yet have any solid plans for her career, so she planned to begin her collegiate studies at Niagara County Community College after graduation. According to her parents, Mandy was a good kid. She had her flaws and was not a straight-A student, but she cared about protecting the environment, loved and respected her parents, and was a good friend. Like many teenagers, Mandy liked to go to parties and experiment with drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes. According to one of her close friends, with whom she would go to parties, Mandy liked to push her limits but was not a problem drinker and did not let herself get out of control. Mandy's parents were concerned about her partying, but they also trusted their daughter's character and decided to set up a system of rules around Mandy's social life rather than attempt to force her to stop going to parties. They would set a curfew for each evening Mandy went out, which Mandy agreed to. If something prevented her from arriving home on time, she would call her parents to tell them why she was delayed and when she would be home. Mandy also had to wake her parents up when she arrived home so they would know she had safely returned. She and her parents had a standing agreement that should she ever find herself in a bad situation, she could call them and they would come get her. Mandy adhered to her parents' set of rules. However, she did not so on September 18, 1993. That Saturday night, Mandy spent the evening with her friend Stacy, Stacy's boyfriend Brian, and Brian's friend Wayne. Stacy would be sleeping over at the Steingasser house, and Mandy had promised her parents that they would return by midnight. Stacy was Mandy's age, but Wayne and Brian were a few years older, meaning they could buy alcohol, and Wayne had his own apartment. That evening, the group went to a liquor store to buy whiskey and rum but were heading to Wayne's apartment on Ironton Street in North Tonawanda. Around 9 p.m., they got into Wayne's car and drove to Buffalo. The group was planning on seeing a rock band play a set at a bar on Forest Avenue. However, Mandy and Stacy were both underage and were not able to get past the bouncer at the door. Brian and Wayne left with them, stopping at a friend's house party before returning to North Tonawanda and Wayne's apartment. By this time, it was clear that Mandy and Stacy were going to miss their midnight curfew. However, for some reason, Mandy deviated from her normal routine and did not call her parents to update them about where she was and when she could get home. At this time, according to Stacy, she and Mandy were buzzed but not overly intoxicated. There was a house party going on at a home on First Avenue, and Mandy, Stacy, Brian, and Wayne decided to walk over to it. However, while they were on their way, a group of men pulled up alongside them in a car. They began yelling at Brian and Wayne, accusing them of harassing a woman from the neighborhood. This had not happened, but the men in the car did not wait for Brian and Wayne to clear things up and instead got out of their car and attacked them. The fight did not last long as sirens were soon heard and the other men got back in their car and took off. Mandy and Stacy had gotten scared and walked away from the scene when the fight broke out. As they got away, they became separated. Brian had yelled for the two girls to come back when the men drove off. Mandy had been afraid that the police would soon be there and insist on driving her home because she was underage, which would have ruined her plan to try to sneak into the house without her parents realizing she had missed curfew. When Mandy did not rejoin the group, Stacy was upset because she thought Mandy had gone home without her. They called Mandy's name several times, but she did not come back to meet them. Mandy apparently began walking to her house, which was over a mile away. She walked north on Oliver Street until she reached a convenience store at the intersection of Fifth Avenue. Witnesses at the intersection saw a passing car make a U-turn in order to pull up next to Mandy as she was walking past the store. Mandy leaned into the passenger side window to talk to the driver, an acquaintance from school, for a few minutes before getting into the car sometime between 1:20 and 1:30 a.m. on September 19th. Mandy was never seen alive again. Mandy's mother, Lorraine, was awoken by a phone call at 2:30 a.m. The call was from Stacy, and Lorraine could hear male voices in the background encouraging her to ask if Mandy had arrived home. Lorraine knew that Mandy had not come home even before searching the rest of the house because Mandy had not come in to wake her up when she arrived, as usual. Lorraine's initial reaction was anger at the fact that her daughter had missed curfew and not called home. She was awake for the rest of the night waiting for Mandy, but she never arrived. In the morning, she began calling around to Mandy's friends, but no one knew where she was. One of Mandy's friends was the daughter of a police officer, and he sent a patrolman over to the Steingasser home to take a missing persons report. The North Tonawanda police quickly came to the conclusion that Mandy was simply a runaway. This frustrated Mandy's parents, who knew her well enough to know that even if she had run away, on her own accord, she still would have called home to tell them so. A boy she had been dating had just moved to Florida, but without a call from Mandy saying she had followed him south, they did not believe that this was the case. The Steingassers, therefore, contacted the FBI, who also began looking into the disappearance. Just over 5 weeks after Mandy was last seen, on October 25, 1993, two men were hunting for mushrooms in Bond Lake Park when they came across a set of badly decomposed human remains near an embankment in a wooded area near Myers Lake. The remains would later be determined to belong to Mandy. Embankment, thinking it would go into the lake. To roll her body down the embankment thinking it would go into the lake, but it was caught on some bushes on the way down. Police did not immediately make Mandy's cause of death public beyond stating that she had extensive injuries to her upper body. It would later be revealed that she had been strangled with her own bra. She had also sustained head injuries, with the autopsy finding 2 brain hemorrhages and a skull fracture near her left temple. Police had become suspicious of the schoolmate whose car Mandy had last been seen getting into within days of her going missing, both because he was the last person known to be with her and because of his behavior after her disappearance. While they publicly discussed that they had a main suspect in the case, they did not publicly identify him. They collected evidence as part of their investigation into him, but the technology available in 1993 was not sensitive enough to tie him to the murder. As technology advanced in the following decades, the evidence was retested and authorities eventually had enough evidence to charge their prime suspect. On April 24, 2018, nearly 25 years after Mandy was killed, Joseph Belstaff was arrested at his residence as he returned home after work. The following day, on Belstaff's 43rd birthday, he was arraigned on a charge of second-degree murder. Mandy's parents never fully recovered from the death of their only child. They stored some old furniture in Mandy's bedroom, but otherwise left it untouched, with all of her belongings left in their place. Richard Steingasser passed away in 2015, 3 years before an arrest was finally made in his daughter's case. Belstaff, then 18 years old, had come into the North Tonawanda Police Detective Bureau 2 days after Mandy went missing, identifying himself as the person who had picked Mandy up at the corner of Oliver and Firth. He told police that Mandy had only been in his car for a few minutes. Shortly after she got into the vehicle and he began driving her home, she decided to go back to the house party she had planned to go to with Wayne, Brian, and Becky. He claimed he turned his car around and dropped her off in front of an old church at Oliver and First. When Mandy got out of his car, she walked up to a Puerto Rican man sitting on the church steps. Bellastat said that this was the last he saw of Mandy. Parts of Bellastat's story were confirmed by witnesses who saw Mandy get into his car, but some were not. Sisters Tanya and Rebecca Coughlin lived in an apartment at the intersection of 5th and Oliver. At the time Mandy got into Bellastat's vehicle in the early morning hours of September 19, 1993, Tanya was outside of their apartment, and Rebecca was watching her from inside through a window. They both confirmed that they saw a car drive past Mandy, then do a U-turn so it could pull up beside her at the intersection. Mandy and the driver spoke for a few minutes before Mandy got into the car and it drove away, turning to drive in the direction Mandy had been walking and the car had originally been driving. The sisters both recognized Belstaff as the driver of the car because they knew him from their old neighborhood, where Belstaff had also lived. Rebecca identified Mandy as the girl who got into his car that night because she recognized her from school. However, there was a key part of the sisters' story that differed from Bellastat's account. Rebecca remained at the window, looking out onto the street for 5 to 6 more minutes. If Bellastat had quickly turned his car around to drive Mandy back to Oliver and First, as he told police, she would have seen his car drive past her apartment. She did not see the car again, which she would have if Belstaff's statement was accurate. Furthermore, police were never able to locate witnesses who saw a Puerto Rican man near the church. Belstaff dropped Mandy off at the church or Mandy anywhere in that area. They did, however, locate 2 witnesses who reported seeing Belstaff cleaning both the inside and outside of his car at a 24-hour coin-operated car wash at 2:15 a.m. or shortly thereafter. On the morning, Mandy got into his car. Several of Belstaff's friends also came forward, admitting that he had asked them to provide a false alibi for him. One of these friends was Jerry Miller. Belstaff asked Jerry to tell police that they had gone to Canada together the night Mandy disappeared so he would stay out of trouble. Jerry initially did so, but gave an accurate statement 3 days later. On September 18th, Jerry had gone to the police station in the city of Tonawanda with Belstaff, who was angry over 2 traffic tickets he had received there and wanted to contest them. When they left the station, Jerry did ask Belstaff to drive to Canada with him to buy beer. The legal purchasing age for alcohol was younger in Canada than it was in the United States. Belstaff declined, stating he was just going to drive around because he was still mad about the tickets. When he returned from Canada later on, Jerry drove past Bellastat's grandmother's house, where Bellastat had been staying, as well as his mother's house, but Bellastat's car was not at either location. Once he was confronted with the statements showing he had asked friends to lie for him and proving he had not gone to Canada that night as he claimed, Bellastat then said that after he dropped off Mandy near the church, he went to a donut shop and then returned home. Bellastat stopped attending the school where he and Mandy had both been students after she disappeared. Bellastat did come in to take 2 polygraphs during the time Mandy was missing. He walked out of the first one because he did not like the tone of the questioning he was subjected to. He completed the second exam, but he was found to be untruthful when he answered no to 2 questions, one asking if he was involved in Mandy's disappearance and the other asking if he was withholding information. After Mandy's body was discovered, police caught Bellastat in another lie. They asked him if he was familiar with the area where the body was found, and he claimed not to be and said he had never been there. However, authorities quickly found a young woman who reported that Bellastat had taken her to the remote location just weeks before Mandy was murdered. Forensic evidence could not prove Bellastat's involvement in Mandy's murder in 1993. A hair was found on Mandy's body, and while testing indicated that it could have come from Bellastat, it could not be conclusively proven to be his. Fibers found on Mandy's clothing were a match to the fibers from the carpet in the back seat area of Bellastat's vehicle, although this only confirmed that she was inside the car, which Bellastat did not dispute. Bellastat's car was seized and searched. It was during the search that the most crucial pieces of evidence were 3 pubic hairs, one found on the front passenger side floor mat and 2 located in the back seat of the vehicle. According to Bellastat, Mandy had only been in the front seat of his car and only for a few minutes. Furthermore, the hairs still had their roots attached, which a forensic expert would later testify meant that they had been pulled from the skin with force. While the attached roots on the hairs would eventually mean that they could be tested for DNA, the technology to do so was not available in 1993. At the time, scientists could only state that the hairs were consistent with Mandy's pubic hair. The hairs were submitted for DNA testing in 2017, which confirmed that they belonged to Mandy Steingasser. This confirmation is what led to authorities finally charging Bellastat with her murder in 2018. Believed that Bellastat had made sexual advances towards Mandy and reacted violently when she wanted the encounter to end, leading to a struggle. When Mandy's body was found, her pants were pulled partway down and had been torn. One of Mandy's fingernails had broken off. Based on the results of the autopsy, investigators argued that Bellastat struck Mandy in the head at some point during the struggle, and when he realized what he had done, he ripped off her bra, tearing out all of its hooks in the process and strangled her with it. After Bellastat's arrest in April of 2018, dates for his trial were set, and then changed as a result of ongoing disagreements over pretrial evidentiary issues. On March 9, 2020, the process of jury selection for the trial finally began, and the selected jury heard opening statements and 1 day of testimony before Niagara County Judge Sarah Sheldon declared a mistrial on March 16th due to concerns that the COVID-19 pandemic would prevent the trial from successfully being completed. The trial finally began on October 25, 2021, 28 years to the day after Mandy's body was found. Bellastat's defense team relied heavily on the fact that traces of another man's DNA were found in Mandy's underwear during further testing in 2019. The DNA belonged to Mandy's ex-boyfriend, Christopher Palish, with whom she was known to have a sexual relationship. Police had investigated him back in 1993, but he had moved to Florida on September 17, 1993, the day before Mandy began her last evening out with her friends. The defense argued that this evidence was exculpatory, and Bellastat should have been released as soon as it was found. The prosecution argued that the defense was using the DNA as a distraction as they were able to account for its presence and the person it belonged to was not even in the state at the time of the murder. During the trial, the defense presented Christopher as an alternative suspect in the case, presenting his criminal charges in Florida for domestic violence and cruelty to animals as supporting evidence. The prosecution presented documents and called witnesses to confirm that Christopher had already moved away when Mandy was killed. On November 16, 2021, the jury returned their verdict. They found Bellastat guilty. In a subsequent interview with the Buffalo News, one of the jurors stated that the jury had not taken the defense's theory that Mandy's ex-boyfriend was responsible for her murder seriously. They went through all of the evidence carefully to be fair to Bellastat and do their job thoroughly, and ultimately found that they could not argue with the compelling scientific evidence. Belstaff's sentencing hearing was held on January 14, 2022. While Belstaff maintained his innocence and his lawyer argued that sending her client to prison for the rest of his life was not justice, Mandy's mother, Lorraine, asked the court to impose a lengthy sentence. "During the time Belstaff has been living his life, my daughter did not," she told the court, adding, "He has been free for 28 years and he should be sentenced for no less." Belstaff was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He plans to appeal his conviction. Niagara County District Attorney Brian D. Seaman believes the case was handled properly and Belstaff's conviction will be upheld upon appeal. When asked what he would say to Mandy if he could speak with her now, he stated, "Mandy, we did everything that we could here to try to bring some level of justice for you and your family. And I'd say that the detectives in North Tonawanda, the individuals that worked in the Niagara County Forensic Lab, they never forgot about you." A Delray Beach, Florida construction worker saw an odd item floating in the intercoastal waterway. It appeared to be a suitcase bobbing along the water. As it moved and as he watched it move with the tide, he saw a human body part protruding from the bag. Delray PD were called and arrived on the scene along with the Coast Guard and secured the bag. Inside were the partial, dismembered human remains. They continued to investigate the area and found 2 more bags with the remains of a single female victim. They stated that the victim was in the early stages of decomposition, putting her time of death sometime between July 17th 20th. Her identity is currently unknown, with no missing persons matching her description. They say that the woman is either white or Latin American, 5'4", with brown hair and brown eyes, and has tattooed eyebrows. Her estimated age is between 30–50. She was wearing a tank top with a unique pattern. The shirt was traced back to a Brazilian brand, Bedsave. She was wearing black shorts and a black undershirt as well. The suitcases were all tied with red ribbons, and law enforcement has provided images of 2 of the 3 suitcases. At this time, law enforcement is not revealing the cause of death. Law enforcement is asking residents in the area to check their security footage of any suspicious activity from July 15th to 24th. In early July, following an anonymous tip, Mexican and U.S. authorities investigated reports of a mass grave site in Reynosa, Mexico, a border town only 4 miles from the U.S. border. Volunteers with the group For the Love of the Disappeared, consisting solely of relatives of the missing and murdered persons in Mexico, conducted the search and uncovered what is believed to be the skeletal remains of approximately 27 people. The remains were discovered to be dismembered, making both identification and cause of death difficult to determine. However, relatives were able to identify 4 victims based on tattoos, though DNA confirmations have yet to be conducted. Officials in Mexico have stated that a thorough investigation will be conducted to identify the persons found. This is, unfortunately, a concerning trend in recent years, with several mass grave sites being found across the country. According to the Advocacy for Human Rights in the Americas, there are over 100,000 missing people in Mexico, and gangs or cartels abduct, murder, and dump victims into mass graves much like this one. Investigating these tips can also be quite dangerous for the volunteers, as cartels have been known to leave false tips and hide explosives. Dozens of people, including some children, have been casualties. After multiple attacks, Mexico has decided to stop having law enforcement show up to these areas to search. Now, search parties mostly consist of mothers of these missing loved ones. A heartbreaking sacrifice these volunteers are making to restore some answers to families. A Portland, Oregon jury is currently deciding the fate of 38-year-old Tony Klein. The former nurse has been found guilty of using his position of authority to intimidate his patients at the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. Klein was employed there from 2010 to 2018, and during his time there, he used his position at the facility to isolate and abuse inmates who came into the medical unit for treatment, as well as inmates who worked in the department as orderlies. He resigned when abuse allegations started to be investigated by Oregon State Police. The U.S. Attorney's Office said in a statement to the media, quote, "By virtue of his position as a medical provider, Klein was often alone with his victims and assaulted many before, during, and after medical treatments. For women who worked in the medical unit, Klein manufactured reasons to get them alone in secluded areas such as medical rooms, janitor's closets, or behind privacy curtains. Klein made it clear to his victims that he was in a position of power over them and that they would not be believed if they tried reporting his abuse. An investigation into Klein began in 2018, when an inmate came forward with a federal lawsuit against Oregon Department of Corrections for a culture of abuse and directly named Klein as a perpetrator of a significant portion of that abuse. His trial began in July, and the jury took 2 days to deliberate the verdict. He was found guilty of 17 counts of sexual assault and 4 counts of making false statements under oath in his 2019 deposition. He faces life in prison, and his sentencing is set for October 17th. Henry Lee is a famous, now celebrity forensic scientist. According to his website, he claims to have been involved in solving 8,000 cases over his impressive 5-decade-long career. Cases he has provided his expertise on include the JonBenet Ramsey investigation and the O.J. Simpson trial. He was a blood spatter expert for the Michael Peterson trial. He also worked on the Caylee Anthony murder investigation. He grew to be a highly desired trial expert, not only in the US but across the globe. His fame also led him to become a serial regular on crime TV programs like Forensic Files, leading him to get his own TV show. However, some of his methods have been called into question. In 2007, he was accused of withholding key evidence in the Phil Spector trial, but it was deemed a mistake, and he was never held accountable for that. Then in 2019, 2 men convicted of a murder in 1985, Ralph Birch and Sean Henning, filed an appeal for citing wrongful conviction and asked to have key evidence used to convict them be retested. The items in question was a towel Henry Lee had testified to contain blood. The appeal was approved and the towel was submitted to modern forensic examination. During that re-examination, it was discovered the towel had never been previously tested and no blood was found. Henry Lee had lied about crucial evidence that had been used to convict 2 men of murder, and they had been in prison for nearly as long as Lee's career. In 2020, their conviction was vacated, which then led the 2 men to filing a federal lawsuit, citing Henry Lee and 8 other members of law enforcement as responsible for their wrongful conviction. On July 21, 2023, the federal judge presided over the lawsuit deemed Lee liable for falsifying evidence along with the prosecutors and the New Milford Police Department. For Lee, this will likely end in paying out damages to the victims. However, he is denied any wrongdoing. Hennings, in a statement to the media, said, quote, "I'm not looking for just compensation in terms of money. I want there to be changes in our system. There is no such thing as justice. You will never get back what they took from you. There is no getting my life back. They took 30 birthdays, 30 summers, weddings, Christmases, funerals, New Year's. There's no words for what they've done to me and my co-defendant. There's no words to describe what it feels like to be in prison for something you didn't do and sit and think, why did this happen? And why is no one coming to fix what they did? There's no words for that. At this point in time, there's no word yet on whether Henry Lee's other cases will be re-examined or if he'll be barred from any further work as a trial expert. Zachary Schick was arrested on July 20th when it was discovered that he'd been posing as a 17-year-old high school student in Lincoln, Nebraska. Lincoln Northwest High School had been the same high school that he graduated from nearly a decade ago. Psyche had been using an elaborate scheme to locate, manipulate, and coerce victims to participate in sexual activities that he then distributed online. Some of the victims, all female, were as young as 13. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of sexual assault and the use of an electronic device and 1 count of sex trafficking a minor. The school district contacted law enforcement when it was discovered that a man had been attending the school with fraudulent documents. Chic had been documents described as well-crafted, which included a falsified birth certificate under the name Zach Hess, transcripts from other schools, immunization records, and other medical records. At this time, victims are still coming forward, but it appears to be a significant amount of young girls who communicated with this man. The exact scope of the victims is unknown at this time, but parents are encouraged to speak to their children. At this time, Sheikh has admitted to impersonating a student, but has denied sexually assaulting any of his victims physically. He is currently being held on a $250,000 bond. The court records have been sealed to protect the identities of the victims. Now, when asked how this could happen, officials revealed that Sykes is 5'4", a pound 120, and, quote, blended in with the other students. On July 13th, first responders were called to a grocery store in Evergreen Park, Illinois. An active shooter was reported, but there was only one victim who was identified as 21-year-old Jolene Flores. The victim had been in the stockroom when her ex-boyfriend came into the store and shot her multiple times. She was declared deceased at the scene. Armani Henry was arrested later that day and charged with first-degree murder. Jolene had recently ended the relationship and had sought out a protective order against Henry, and it had been granted, but it had never been served. 3 days before she was murdered, she discovered an Apple AirTag on her vehicle. She and her brother discovered that the AirTag was connected to Henry's cell phone and smashed it. He later turned up at her place of work, threatening her and her family if she cut contact with him. She had filed a second protective order the day before the attack. Her cell phone showed that on July 13th, she had 124 text messages from Henry threatening to kill her. According to court records from Chicago, Armani Henry had a history of domestic violence and had previously been convicted of battery. He has been charged with murder and is being held in custody while he waits his next court date on August 11th. 36-year-old Peaches Sturgo has been sentenced to 3 years in prison for defrauding an elderly man experiencing a cognitive decline of his entire life savings. Sturgo met the victim 8 years ago on a dating website, and since then posed as not only a companion to the victim, but also as working from various financial institutions. She created fake emails and posed as a bank employee, convincing the man that he had outstanding debts that needed to be paid. The victim was 86, a Holocaust survivor, and he lost his home in the process. The frauds were only discovered when the victim's son began going through his financial records. Sturgo, on the other hand, moved into a gated community, had multiple vehicles which included a boat, went on lavish vacations, and spent $101,000 on designer purchases. Sturgo also referred to her ongoing scam as her quote business and often went to the victim's home to steal items to resell. Text messages between her and her real-life partner revealed that she often would make fun of the victim for believing that she loved him and lamented when he couldn't send her any more money. She also said in text messages, quote, "I'm just aggravated, hurt, frustrated that I haven't made money. I don't want to work. It's too hard." Strider was arrested on January 2023 and charged with 1 count of wire fraud. She has pleaded guilty to the charge. The victim sent a letter to the courts during the sentencing hearing and he said, quote, "As a Holocaust survivor, I have endured unspeakable pain and loss in my life, but never did I imagine that I would be subjected to such heartless betrayal in my old age. At the age of 6, I lost both my parents in the Holocaust, and it wasn't until 10 that I had an opportunity to sit at a school desk for the first time." He also wrote, quote, "I grew up in a boarding school surrounded by the echoes of the horrors I had experienced. Determined to make a better life for myself, I moved to the United States in my early 20s. Over the next 60 years, I worked tirelessly to establish a successful business, family, and home in New York. And now I'm 88 years old, and the last laying I expected was to finish my days in the same manner I started them, penniless and betrayed." The judge noted that the exceptional cruelty Sturgot placed upon the victim, and she was sentenced at the end of July to 51 months in prison and was ordered to pay back just over $2,800,000 to the victim. She was also ordered to forfeit the home she purchased, jewelry, Rolex watches, and 100 luxury items. A 67-year-old man, Ivan Savastino, walked into a Wells Fargo in Lakewood, New Jersey, and attempted to rob the bank by slipping a note to the teller. The teller simply said no, so the man walked out of the Wells Fargo and went across the street to a TD bank. At the second bank, the man repeated the same process, handing the same note to the teller. At the TD, the teller handed over $1,500 cash, and Ivan walked out. This isn't Ivan's first time making the news. In 2018, he was charged with a dozen counts of animal cruelty when it was discovered he was hoarding cats in his home. Over 50 animals were removed by the SPCA in what was described as a deplorable living condition. Ivan then robbed another bank on July 6th and was arrested shortly after. He has been charged with 2 counts of robbery, and is being held in county jail while he awaits further court proceedings. It was around 1 a.m. on July 28th when a family discovered a man stuck in their chimney. The man was known to the family and was 47-year-old Irvin Ortiz Guzman and had been violating a protection order against him while trying to break in. Guzman had made it about 2/3 down the way of the chimney before the flue became too narrow, and he found himself lodged inside. He screamed, which alerted the family inside, and they called 911. Firefighters had to work for 2 hours to pull him back up the chimney. He was extracted without any serious injuries, but was taken to the hospital for treatment for minor issues. Guzman now faces criminal trespassing charges and violating a protection order. Firefighters would like to remind the public that despite chimneys being okay for Santa to get in and out of, humans are not capable of going down chimneys. At 26, Loretta Saunders was at an exciting point in her life, studying criminology at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada. She came from a large, loving family of 7 siblings, and though they lived far apart, they were tightly connected. Loretta, an Inuk woman from Newfoundland and Labrador, and her family had endured significant adversity over the years. Her sibling, DM, formerly known as Delilah, shared that both had faced physical and sexual abuse as children, lacked access to education, and battled drug addiction. Loretta had just entered adulthood when she made the bold decision to move alone to Montreal. The transition was challenging, and soon, her mother Miriam revealed, Loretta was struggling deeply with addiction, at one point living on the streets. However, Miriam said Loretta was determined to overcome her addiction and was highly motivated to rebuild her life. Loretta started on a methadone treatment program, and once her life was back under control, she applied to study at St. Mary's University. She was over the moon when she was accepted and had already decided once she had finished her course, she was going to train to be a lawyer. When it came to the topic for her university thesis, she knew right away what she wanted to focus on: missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. It was something she was very passionate about giving a voice to, given her and her family's experiences. And she hoped one day to work on documentaries about it. She was in a great relationship with Yelchin Sokolt, and the couple had been going strong for almost 3 years. Yelchin said they had just been to visit his family in Turkey, and he had told everyone he knew that she was the one. More joy came when she found out that she was 3 months pregnant, and she couldn't wait to start a family. She and Yelchin were now living together at his house, so she sublet her apartment to make some extra money. Loretta Saunders had a lot of great things ahead of her and had made such huge and positive changes in her life. It was a fresh and exciting start for her and Yelchin. She had a baby on the way, was 2 months away from her graduation, and she couldn't wait for her future. February 14th, 2014, DM received a call from Yelchin asking if Loretta was around. He hadn't seen her since yesterday and was panicking. Yelchin had received 2 weird text messages from Loretta. He said she seemed tense and had apparently locked herself out of her online banking. "I'm so stressed that I can't even remember my own mother's maiden name," the message read. He then got another text saying she was going to stay with a friend and that she would talk to him later. He had no idea who this friend was, and the message was blunt and short, without giving any details. But DM hadn't heard anything or seen her either. As the hours ticked by, Loretta's mother and father were now starting to worry too. For someone that was in contact with her family every hour of the day, alarm bells were ringing. Over the next couple of days, everybody was phoning each other, hoping that someone had had contact with Loretta, but no one had. Her car was also gone, but all of her belongings were at home. On day 3, the police were called, and a missing persons report was filed. Detectives turned up to Loretta and Yelchin's home. To everyone's understanding, Yelchin was the last person to have seen her. He said that on February 13th, Loretta had had a busy day planned with lots of errands and studying in between. Her day started with heading to her apartment to collect the rent from her tenants. And after this, she was pretty much on the move all day. He told police she hadn't been stressed when she'd left the house. She was always so organized and composed, so the 2 text messages he had received from her were very out of character. Police spent some time searching the couple's home, but ultimately left, feeling confident that Yelchin had nothing to do with her being missing, and he was just as scared for her as everybody else was. Officers then headed over to her apartment, 41 Cowie Hill Drive, room 1003. There was no one there, but there didn't seem to be anything out of place. Everything was tidy and nothing seemed amiss. Neighbors said that the couple living there left a few days ago to go away on a Valentine's break, and no one had visited since. The camera footage from downstairs gave a clear view of the entrance and showed that Loretta had in fact arrived at the building just before 11 a.m. on February 13th. Given the fact that she had now been missing for 4 days, there was a lot of footage to get through. It was possible she could have stayed in her apartment while her tenants were gone and then left a couple of days later. So every camera and exit needed to be checked. An online fundraiser was set up to help bring Loretta's 5 brothers and parents from Newfoundland and Labrador to Nova Scotia. In a matter of days, they had reached their goal, and the family could finally be together. Detectives got hold of Blake and Victoria, Loretta's tenants, but they said they hadn't seen or heard anything from her in days either. They said they were currently way out of town, 200 miles away, so they couldn't really be of much help. Detectives soon found out that Loretta's cards were still active and being used via contactless payments, and everyone felt hopeful that this was a good sign. On February 13th, just before 5 p.m., Loretta's cards had been used inside a store. The cameras showed her car parked outside, but the woman that used the card didn't look like Loretta. Several minutes later, her card was used again at a Tim Hortons, about 10 miles away from her apartment. A lady wearing a blue jacket could be made out, and as soon as the employee moved to the side, the person driving could be seen as well. It was clearly not Loretta either. 5 days later, detectives back in Halifax received a call from another police department. Loretta's car had been located. It was miles away in Harrow, Ontario, and it was parked outside someone's house. The people inside the house were none other than Blake Leggett and Victoria Henberry, Loretta's tenants. They were arrested for possessing a stolen vehicle, but police still needed to establish exactly what had happened, where Loretta was, and if they actually had anything to do with her being missing. Blake told officers that Loretta had sold him the car before they went away. He said that the car was cheaper than a flight, so he gladly accepted the offer. But police soon discovered that the pair were wanted on unrelated charges. Blake had an outstanding warrant for not appearing in a Calgary court, and Victoria was wanted for threatening someone back in Halifax. When they were searched, Loretta's phone was found on Victoria, and Blake had Loretta's bank cards. Police watched back through the cameras in the apartment building, looking for Blake or Victoria on them. And at 2:30 on February 13th, Blake appeared, carrying a clearly heavy hockey bag. He took the bag outside, returned, and then half an hour later, he came back out with yet more bags. This happened for the third and final time, and this time he was with Victoria. Knowing what they now did, police said the video was disturbing. It was obvious to them that Loretta was likely inside that hockey bag, and they weren't going to find her alive. Neither Blake nor Victoria were talking, but when police finally got into Blake's phone, they found as close to an admission as they were going to get. Just days before Loretta was last seen, Blake filmed Victoria as the pair were having a drunken argument. Detectives knew that Victoria would be easier to crack than Blake, and they confronted her with the video. After a long silence, she finally said he did it. He killed her. He smothered her with a bag. And she said the reason was all to avoid paying the rent that they owed. It soon came to light that Loretta had actually asked the pair to leave the apartment after months of not receiving any rent or receiving it late. They owed her around $600, and Loretta had reached her limit. She had gone over that day with the intention of waiting until she was paid and then making sure they left. Police pushed Victoria for more answers and begged her to tell them where Loretta was. 2 weeks after the search for Loretta began, Victoria agreed to lead investigators to her. On the side of a highway about 300 miles away, her body was finally found. She was still inside the hockey bag, and an autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled. Despite Victoria's partial admission, both Blake and Victoria entered pleas of not guilty. Although their lawyers pushed for them to be tried separately, a judge denied this request and said that they would be tried at the same time. Just as their trial was about to begin, there was a sudden change in their pleas. An agreed statement of facts were presented to the court. The pair each gave their version of events, and the alleged truth about what had happened that day finally came out. They both said that as Loretta sat on the chair waiting for them to give her the rent, Blake came up behind her and started choking her. Loretta fought back hard and the pair fell onto the floor. Blake then tried to suffocate her with 4 plastic bags, but Loretta tore through all of them. Blake then banged her head off the floor twice until she stopped moving. After this, Blake wrapped her head in plastic wrap and placed her into his hockey bag. Blake dragged the hockey bag downstairs and placed her in the back of her own car. The pair then set off as if nothing had happened. They used Loretta's bank card to buy food for the trip. But when they didn't know the password, Victoria used Loretta's phone, pretending to be Loretta, and messaged Yelchin. Loretta Saunders had lost her life simply so Blake and Victoria could avoid paying $600. It's clear that she fought for her life with absolutely everything she had. It was senseless and needless, and the way that the pair had hatched their plan and their attempts to cover everything up is both horrifying and disturbing. Following their statement of facts, Blake pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and Victoria pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Blake's lawyer said it was his idea to plead guilty. He did not want to have the Saunders family go through the very grueling process of a public trial, with all of that evidence coming out over the next 4 weeks. Blake received an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, and Victoria was also sentenced to life in prison, but she can apply for parole after 10 years. The judge called the crime despicable, horrifying, and cowardly. For the family, emotions, understandably, ran high the whole time. At one point, DM lunged at Blake and Victoria, screaming at them, and as the family left the courtroom, someone shouted to Blake, saying they'd be waiting for him when he gets out. In early 2017, Victoria sought to withdraw her guilty plea, claiming she wasn't in her right mind when she had changed it. This was denied just a couple of months later. After this, Victoria started telling people that she had indigenous ancestry on her mother's side. But the parole board noted that they had no knowledge of this history. The community and Loretta's family said this was nothing more than an insult to Loretta to claim something like this. They called it a gimmick and a game to her. 2 years later, Victoria contacted an Indigenous Women's Support Center, hoping they could help get her out of prison. But the center denied her application. Victoria then asked for a pass to attend an Indigenous women's sharing and drumming circle. A parole board granted her the pass, but the pass was quickly revoked after a strong public reaction. Victoria is now prohibited from accessing any Indigenous services. In 2014, a First Nations 15-year-old called Tina Fontaine was reported missing and later found wrapped in plastic and weighed down in the Red River. A 53-year-old man was charged, but due to no forensic evidence, he was found not guilty. In the aftermath of Loretta's and Tina's murders and many other women and girls' murders and or disappearances, advocacy groups, including the #AmiNext campaign, begged for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This was officially launched in 2017 and finalized in 2019. DM put a blog together called A Homicide Survivor's Journey Through Grief and started working closely with Matthew Smiley, who created the documentary Highway of Tears, a film about the notorious Highway 16 and the First Nations people who have gone missing or were killed along the 724-kilometer stretch in British Columbia. 2 Halifax theaters screened the documentary in support of the Loretta Saunders Scholarship Fund, a scholarship which would help Indigenous women pay for post-secondary education. DM said, "It's just to honor Loretta, what she wanted to do, what she wanted to raise. She wanted to do what Matt did. She should have been here as a brilliant writer. He's a filmmaker, writer. They should have been on this side helping the cause. And now she's another statistic. A lot of work that I do, I think subconsciously, I want my sister to be proud of me." DM was soon given the Ambassador of Conscience Award by Amnesty International. "I learned so much from my sister's short time on Earth. She taught me many lessons and continues to guide and inspire me. I hope in sharing her experiences and my own, I am able to do the same for someone else." In a devastating turn of events, in September 2021, Miriam Saunders announced that DM had died. After losing Loretta, DM's addiction had spiraled even more, resulting in liver failure. DM suddenly stopped taking their medication, in a desperate bid to get clean, and started drinking to curb the pain from the withdrawal. It was later confirmed that DM had died from accidental suffocation and other complications linked to ongoing issues with addiction. There was so much devastation caused to so many lives because of what happened on February 13th, and the aftermath is still widely felt. Loretta Saunders was in an amazing and exciting place in her life, with everything at her fingertips and a new baby on the way. Her biggest passion in life was raising awareness, helping to educate people, and hopefully seeing big changes one day come. It seems only right to end with an extract from Loretta's thesis, a thesis she was so proud of and excited to one day share. My story isn't unique. Thousands of girls are exposed to the exact same experiences that I couldn't even fathom wishing upon another human being. It is through this project that I aspire to educate and enlighten others, as well as provide hope and inspiration that change is possible. It was on November 14, 1971, when best friends, 15-year-old Maria Johnson and 15-year-old Debbie Ackerman, set out for a surfing trip headed out for Galveston, Texas. Galveston is known for its beautiful beaches, year-round sunny weather, and some of the best surfing in the United States. The two teens weren't nearly inseparable. Debbie was outgoing, bubbly, and remembered as always laughing. Maria was more shy. Lots of people knew her to be quiet, but close friends knew her true and chatty nature. The two were just starting out in life and were full of hope and promise. Excellent students who both loved the outdoors, especially surfing. Debbie was a champion water skier. Born and raised in Galveston, she was a natural at water sports and took to it easily. Maria had recently moved to the island, and the two had met at Ball High School, and the two quickly became best friends. The families of Maria and Debbie were also well acquainted with each other. Given their daughter's strong bond, there was no issue with them being out or going out on day trips, but the rule was that they stick together, call home if plans changed, and to be home by curfew. That day, the girls planned to visit Houston, Texas, which is around 55 miles from Galveston or about an hour's drive. As the girls were both 15, they didn't have cars yet and planned to hitchhike. But it was the 1970s, and it was incredibly common for young men and women to hitchhike across the globe. Whilst the practice has been outdated as pretty dangerous now, in the 1970s, many young people saw it as the perfect way to get around. Hitchhiking in a pair seemed less dangerous than trying to hitch a ride alone. It was around midday on that Sunday. They were near Stewart Beach, outside of a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. Witnesses reported seeing the two buy ice cream and then start asking around for rides. A man in a white van pulled up to the curb and asked the girls where they were going. The two replied that they needed to get to Houston, and coincidentally, Houston was on his route. The two giggled as they got into their ride, not knowing it would be the last time they would ever be seen alive. Debbie and Maria's parents began to worry when they didn't receive a call from their daughters. Before the time of cell phones, the parents had no way of knowing if the girls had made it safely to Houston. The next morning, the worried parents called the Houston Police Department to report their daughters missing. Thankfully, the report was taken seriously, and they were not dubbed as runaways as many teens were during this time. The Galveston Police and Houston Police collaborated to coordinate a statewide search for the two girls. 2 days later, on November 17, 1971, the search for the two girls ended in heartbreak. A fisherman found the body of Maria first in Turner's Bayou in Texas City, roughly 18 miles from Galveston. Law enforcement then found Debbie's body 100 yards away. Both girls had their hands bound, had their clothes from their waist down removed, sexually assaulted, and shot twice to the back of the skull. Their bodies were then dumped in the waters below. The crime rocked Galveston, the state of Texas, and the nation, who would be so callous towards such young girls who were only trying to get to Houston. Despite the enormous media outcry, there were few leads, and the case quickly went cold. The families of Debbie and Maria made multiple appeals for the guilty party to come forward, but those appeals fell on deaf ears. But the murder of these two young girls was not going to be the end for Texas law enforcement. Throughout the 1970s, there were going to be many more murders, all of similar circumstances to plague Texas. This would only be the beginning, and a week after Debbie and Maria's bodies were discovered, the body of 14-year-old Colette Anais Wilson was found near the Addicks Reservoir. Colette had been missing since June 17th and had been abducted from Alvin, Texas after band practice. She had also been shot execution style to the back of the skull. After the discovery of Colette, another body was found nearby. This would be 19-year-old Glory and Gonzalez. She had disappeared from near her apartment on October 28th. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Then in January 1972, two boys found the bodies of 13-year-old Sharon Lynn Shaw and Rhonda Renee Johnson in Clear Lake, Galveston. The remains had been skeletal by the time they were discovered. The girls had been missing since August 4, 1971. They'd been abducted while at the beach in Harris County. In addition to these murders, there were 5 others, bringing the total to 11, all in a 12-month period, all with similar circumstances. Over the years, that number would grow to nearly 30 in the area, all unsolved cold cases. Debbie and Maria's case would be reopened in 1998 when convicted killer Edward Harold Bell sent letters to prosecutors in the area, confessing to the murders of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in 1971, along with 9 others. The letter started off with, "Dear Sir, I have decided to tell you I was brainwashed into killing Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson in November 1971, and went on to say, quote, if you could get me immunity from prosecution of any kind, I could lay a lot of stuff on you, and I will. However, when examined, the confessions were deemed as unreliable evidence and dismissed. Bell was interviewed, but he asked for immunity in exchange for testimony and refused to cooperate. Harris County prosecution has gone on to say that letters have now been lost, though detectives who had been able to see the letters stated that there had been information about the crimes that had never been revealed to the public, leaving some to believe they were credible. Edward Bell was already serving a 71-year prison sentence for the murder of Larry Dickens. It was on August 24, 1978, when Bell was in Pasadena, California, parked in a local neighborhood. He was in his vehicle without pants on, watching a group of girls playing. A father and former Marine supervising the kids saw what was going on in the vehicle, and approached Bell, attempting to get the vehicle's keys so that Bell couldn't flee the scene. While confronting him, Bell drew a pistol and shot Larry. Larry was wounded and crawling back to his driveway when Bell got out of his vehicle, grabbed a shotgun from the back, and killed Larry Dickens before getting his keys and attempting to flee. He was caught soon after by law enforcement. Edward Bell had been released on a $125,000 bail, but when he was released he fled the state, eluding law enforcement for 14 years. He fled the country for Mexico and then Central America. It was a tip that came in that he was in Panama after he was shown on the TV program America's Most Wanted. It was there he was arrested and extradited back to California. Edward Bell was born in southern Texas in 1939, primarily living in the Houston area. He'd went to university to become a teacher, but it doesn't appear that he ever was. He was first arrested in 1966 for exposing himself to minors. He escaped jail by asking the judge for leniency and opted for psychiatric treatment, which he received. After treatment, he was arrested again in 1969 for the same crime. Again, jail was avoided in favor of psychiatric treatment. His first wife divorced him and also cut ties with his 3 children, citing him as a danger to herself and their kids. While in treatment, it was discovered that he was romancing patients there, and he ended up marrying a 17-year-old he met while in treatment. He was 31 at that time. After his release, he moved to Galveston with his new wife and became involved in a local surfing business. It was an area that Maria Johnson and Debbie Ackerman had been known to frequent, along with several other of these cold case victims. In 1974, he was arrested again, this time for violently sexually assaulting a patient that he'd met at a mental hospital he'd previously been at. The charges were dropped in that case as well, and he was never formally charged. He was arrested several times throughout his time in Texas, but each time he would always elude being formally charged. He eventually left Texas and moved to California. That was when the Larry Dickens murder occurred. So, an extensive criminal history of inappropriate behavior towards minors, sexual assault, violence, and abduction. He would brag to his friends that he could talk himself out of anything. But for such an extensive criminal history, it's shocking that he was still allowed to walk free for as long as he did. And whilst Edward Bell somewhat claimed responsibilities for the murders, he would later recant his confessions, making this case all the more confusing. Bell told the Daily Mail that his father had brainwashed him as a child to be a flasher and to sexually assault and kill girls. In his original letter, he confessed to murdering Debbie and Maria along with Sharon Shaw, Rhonda Renee Johnson, Colette Anise Wilson, Gloria and Gonzalez, Georgia Gear, Brooks Bracewell, Nina Lynn Kluge, and Kimberly Ray Pitchford, who had been a 16-year-old, murdered in 1973 and hadn't been believed to be connected to the other murders. He also confessed to an unnamed victim that has yet to be identified. He referred to them in his letters as the 11 that went to heaven. Bell then went on to take several interviews with local newspapers in 2017, quote, and did not kill Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson. He explained that he had confessed to the murders because he was suicidal at the time and wanted the state to sentence him to the death penalty. He also blamed his depression on a network of government spies that were conspiring against him. Throughout his various prison interviews, Bell mentions the supposed program that he was put through and the brainwashing he endured. In his letters, he confessed to callously taking the lives of Debbie Maria and countless other women, but he also notes that he was brainwashed to do so. One of the journalists who interviewed him believes that he suffers from some sort of severe psychiatric disorder. She described his behavior as erratic, paranoid, and full of grand conspiracies about the government. He never took full responsibility for the murders he committed. Instead, he said that he was forced to buy the program. And despite concerns that he was making everything up, the details about the crimes themselves were clear and matched police reports that were never made public. In addition to the confessions and that he lived in the area of the abductions, he also owned a white van. We know about the van because he was arrested while driving it in January 1972 for exposing himself to minors. This van matched the description of the vans that Debbie and Maria had last been seen getting into. At this point in time, it's unclear because it hasn't been made public if there's DNA evidence to compare. And it's also unclear if Texas law enforcement is continuing to look into Edward Bell as a suspect. It doesn't mean they aren't, it just means it isn't publicly available. There's also no solid evidence that we know of tying him to any of the murders at this point in time. All of the current evidence is circumstantial. Though records show even when he was in Panama, wherever Edward Bell lived, teenage girls were abducted and murdered. A string of cold cases seem to follow him in all of the places he has ever been known to reside in. Unfortunately, Edward Bell passed away in 2019 at the age of 80 before investigators could verify his accounts further. Maria's sister told local media that she had no words for Edward Harold Bell, but was happy that he, quote, no longer walks this earth and will never be paroled. The case of Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson remains unsolved. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Galveston County District Attorney, Jack Rohde, at 1-800-566-2209. 8-year-old Madison Middleton, known as Maddie, lived with her mother Laura. She was an only child and she, her mother and father Michael were a tight trio. The family lived in the Tannery Art Center apartment complex, a really unique campus that provides affordable living for families and artists, a place they can live and create art together in their little community. Everyone in the complex was close. They would all create things and spend time together. All the children would hang out in the courtyard and play games. For a young girl that loved all things creative, it was the perfect place for her to grow up. She would often paint little toy animals and create plays and stories with them. She loved to sing, dance, and draw. Her mother Laura said Maddie was such a generous child, always the first to try and help someone or stand up for someone that was on their own or needed support. She was bright, intuitive, and curious, never without a smile on her face. Everyone in the apartment complex knew her as Chatty Maddie, and she would talk to anyone and everyone, always making friends and entertaining people. July 26th was a Sunday. Maddie was enjoying the last part of her weekend. Her friend took him over and was now playing a board game with her mom Laura. Maddie was waiting for them to finish and decided she was going to play with her new present while they wrapped up the game. She had just got a scooter a few days before and couldn't wait to take it around the courtyard before it got dark. At 4 p.m., she was seen by several neighbors. She was also spotted a few times after this just riding around and having fun. Occasionally, She stopped to talk to a few of the other children, but was happy to be by herself. At 5 o'clock and 7 seconds p.m., she was seen going past some mailboxes. This was the last time anyone saw Maddie. After this, she vanished. Her mother Laura thought she might have met another friend and started going door to door. There were around 100 apartments in the 8-acre complex. But with each person that answered saying they hadn't seen her, the panic was mounting. She was nowhere. Officers rapidly descended on the apartments and got to work without hesitation. Her family said that although Maddie was confident, she knew not to wander off by herself, go too far, or talk to people that she didn't know. So detectives knew her disappearance was out of character. Despite this, an Amber Alert was not issued because they said the case did not meet certain criteria. An Amber Alert is an emergency alert system that sends out information about an endangered missing or abducted child. An extensive search was now underway, which included the involvement of the Santa Cruz Police Department, a Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office search and rescue team, and a K-9 unit. But it was soon dark and they hadn't found anything. By 11 a.m. the next day, 50 FBI officers were on the case, going door to door in the area and requesting everyone look in their garages and check their bins, gardens, and sheds. By this point, the complex had already been searched, top to bottom, and the hunt for Maddie was now spreading into the outer areas. Hundreds of volunteers arrived to search. Police had now received over 1,000 tips, and it was clear to see how much this case had resonated with the public and how much they were trying to help bring her home. As the police approached the 24-hour mark, they decided to refocus their search back inwards. With such a small window of time in which she suddenly vanished, they felt confident that the answers lay in the apartment complex somewhere. They started a more thorough and intense search of the buildings. Just over a day after the search for Maddie had started, it came to a painful and abrupt end. At 8 p.m. on July 27th, her body was found in a bag inside a recycling bin in the first-floor garage of the apartment complex. One of the investigators said everyone's hearts sank when they found her, but they quickly regrouped as the missing persons case was now a major homicide investigation. No sooner had this happened, police announced that they had made an arrest. More shocking still, the suspect lived in the apartment complex and he was just 15 years old. At 9 p.m. on July 28th, the broken community came together for a vigil. Because of his age, the teenager's identity was protected. But all this changed when Santa Cruz County District Attorney Jeff Roselle issued a statement. He announced that they had sufficient evidence against him and he would be charging the teen as an adult not only for murder but also for kidnapping and sexual assault. And with this, his name was released. The suspect in custody turned out to be Adrian Jerry Gonzalez, known as Ajay, and he had lived in the apartment for the last 6 years with his mother. It was a bombshell for the neighbors, and the fact that he could have been involved left them shocked. Not knowing any details, everybody at first thought that this must have been an accident and AJ had panicked and tried to cover it up. Everybody described him as likable and polite, often spending time outside with the other children, teaching them how to do yo-yo tricks and play the piano. He even worked as a counselor for the younger children. Everyone loved and trusted him, and this was an unfathomable thing to process. We love this guy. All of us, if you ask us what you think of him, would tell you he's an outstanding kid, our post the child, one neighbor said. But others argued his social media posts pointed to someone who was far more troubled than anyone had realized, with many of his posts having disturbing captions. It was also said that he had abused his dog years before, and one of his friends had urged him to seek help when he started threatening to jump off of buildings. What had initially drawn police to AJ that day was that he was watching them intently as they were searching the bins. And the second the officers realized that Maddie was in there, he started to run, despite the fact he wouldn't have been able to even see what they had found. He had been helping in the searches and involving himself in the investigation from the beginning, asking everyone questions about what they knew and if anyone had heard anything, something that seemed innocuous. But when police questioned him after he ran away, they realized something was very wrong and he did have something to hide. They wouldn't go into detail about what he had said or what evidence they had uncovered in his apartment, which was likely due to his age and how much they were allowed to reveal. An examination of Maddie's body came in the following day, and it was determined that her mouth had been bound with tape. She had been beaten and raped before being strangled and stabbed. It was such a monstrous crime, and what poor Maddie had gone through was horrendous. After being formally interviewed, AJ admitted to what he had done. He said that he had lured Maddie into his apartment by offering her some ice cream. Maddie knew AJ well and trusted him. As she was helping herself to the ice cream, he attacked her from behind. After he bound her and assaulted her, he strangled her before forcing her into the bag she was later found in. As he was doing this, he realized that she was still alive. He subsequently stabbed her in the neck. Medical examiners concluded that she had ultimately died of positional asphyxiation from her position in the recycling bin. District Attorney Jeff Roselle said, "We are going to bring him to justice. He is looking at life in prison." He also said that he thought being charged and tried as an adult was the only appropriate course of action, and that AJ was a sexual deviant with no place in society. Judge Salazar agreed with Jeff Roselle and determined that AJ's trial should go through the adult court system instead of the juvenile one. He cited Prop 57, which was passed by voters and allowed judges to decide whether or not a teen should be tried as an adult. AJ entered a plea of not guilty despite his admissions. But his defense team were fighting hard to transfer his case back to juvenile court using the controversial Senate Bill 1391, which had just come into effect. SB 1391 prohibits anyone 14 or 15 years old from being tried as an adult. They also said that the reasons behind why he did what he did stemmed from a tough home and school life and being socially awkward. But people that knew the Gonzalez family said that this was simply not true. His mother, Reggie, had left his father when the relationship had turned violent, and her children were her biggest priority. They said that AJ was showered with love and affection, and he came from a caring family that had done their best given their situations. They said that although Reggie had battled drug and alcohol issues, she was now clean and doing her best to repair any damage that had been done. The police and prosecution said that numerous people have tougher upbringings than most, and this is not the outcome. They said that using his mother and his upbringing as some kind of justification for what he had done was heartbreaking. Thousands of people signed a petition to stop SB 1391 applying to AJ's case, but it was in vain when, after much deliberation and appeals by AJ's defense team, the Supreme Court ruled that his case should be transferred to a juvenile court. This was met with huge backlash, and the community were horrified that something so awful could happen to someone so vulnerable and be met with potentially just a few years in prison. Judge Salazar also expressed his feelings, saying that his hands were tied by the change in the law and that he had no choice. He said, allowing all 14-15-year-olds accused of first-degree murder and other violent offenses to remain in the juvenile court is not promoting public safety, because not all of them can be safely rehabilitated. Following this decision, in April 2021, Adrian Jerry Gonzalez changed his plea. He finally pleaded guilty to 6 felony counts, including the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Maddie more than 5 years prior. Before his sentencing, AJ said he hoped that the family would forgive him one day. "I understand there is very little I can say, after all the pain and suffering I have caused. My goal is to work on my issues, so no one else has to experience what you have endured. I am aware that does not change the fact that I have brought you tragedy, loss, and devastation. I am hopeful that, when I take the time to apologize, that you may accept my apologies for the actions that I have done and what they have brought you," he said. Maddie's father Michael said he has accepted his daughter's loss and that he has forgiven AJ. "That doesn't make anything easier. It just allows me peace. The alternative could be to hold to the darkness, but this would only consume my soul. I refuse to poison my soul in existence. Forgiveness is the only path. And I believe that Madison would agree," he gracefully said. Laura said her daughter's death left her suffering with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting in her being unable to work. Even AJ's attorney expressed his relief that this was all coming to an end, so that Maddie's family did not have to go through any more than what they already had. In the adult court system, AJ was facing a 126 years to life in prison. But the juvenile court system gave a very different sentence. Judge Salazar imposed the maximum sentence he possibly could, given the circumstances. The law as it stands now determined that AJ's maximum term of confinement ends when he turns 25. This will be in October 2024. There is no guarantee he'll be released in 2024, however, as the court can be petitioned to extend his time. Although District Attorney Jeff Roselle said, he sadly believes it might be. I think it's likely he will be out at 25, and I think it's an absolute travesty of justice, and I think it's unsafe for the community, he said. AJ must also register for life as a sex offender and pay $22,000 in restitution fees. Maddie's grandfather, Dan, said that the sentencing ignores all the evidence pointing towards him being a danger to society. He also predicts that SB 1391 will have dire consequences for future cases. An unlikely bond was formed between Laura and AJ's mom, Reggie, during the ordeal. Reggie was devastated that her son would do this, and neighbors would frequently see her crying at Maddie's memorial. Laura would often sit with her, hugging her, telling her she wasn't to blame. She said, "I just love her and we both lost our children that day. That's the tragic truth. I don't fault her." More pain would soon come for the grieving family. Maddie's father carried her ashes around with him inside his car so that she could stay close to him. But the family were left devastated when someone broke into the car and stole them. They have sadly never been recovered. Maddie was from such a tight community who continue to honor her name and her memory through arts and creative works. She loved animals, but wolves especially, and a wolf sand sculpture was made for her on a beach near her home. The Rio Theater put her name up outside, and paintings done by the artist that lived in the apartment were also put up everywhere. A celebration of life was also held where 100 turned up, and the mayor Don Lane commemorated her life by declaring October 5, 2015 as Madison Middleton Day, her birthday. The family also founded Inquest, Maddie Child Angel of Santa Cruz. Their motto is, "Before you go, let someone know." The aim is to educate children and parents about safety and protection. Tannery Art Center apartment complex has never been the same since and probably never will be. The little community everyone had worked so hard to form, once so close and safe, has been changed forever. Laura said that Maddie was the light and love of her life and brought so much joy to so many people. She was growing up beautifully, bright, perky, fun, and generous of heart. She was the best thing I ever made. Diane Dawn was always a free spirit. She grew up in New Jersey but spent a year away from her family as an exchange student in Austria. She was 4 years older than her sister, Victoria, but the two were still very close. Because of her year abroad, Diane completed her final year of high school a year late, meaning that her and Victoria's high school careers overlapped for a year. While Diane would help Victoria learn things like music and foreign languages, during that year she also helped her skip school so that they could go skiing together. She was an accomplished musician who was skilled at playing the violin. Victoria moved to California, which separated her from Diane for several years. But Diane eventually followed, moving to California to be near her sister again. In 1988, 29-year-old Diane was living in an apartment complex on Graves Avenue in Santee, California with her 2-year-old son, Mark. Mark and Victoria's daughter, Christine, had been born only a few months apart from one another, and Diane and Victoria spent as much time together as they could with their children. Diane worked for the San Diego Transit Corporation, where she had become their first female radio repair technician. Diane failed to report to work on Monday, May 2, 1988. One of Diane's co-workers therefore went over to her apartment to check on her. When they entered the apartment, they found Diane deceased in a back room. She had been stabbed in the chest, and it would later be determined that she had also been bludgeoned. She was nude, but an examination of her body did not find any signs that she had been sexually assaulted. Diane's young son was found wandering in a nearby area of the apartment complex, thankfully unharmed. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department did not find any signs of forced entry into Diane's apartment, nor did they find a motive for anyone to want to kill Diane. Diane's son Mark was adopted by a family friend and grew up with 2 older brothers. He remained close with his birth mother's family and regularly saw his aunt, cousins, and grandparents. Even with a loving adoptive family and a strong relationship with his biological family, Mark still sometimes felt alone as he grew up, knowing he had lost his mother. As years passed without a resolution to Diane's case, her family began losing hope. I didn't think anything was ever going to come of this. I thought I, myself, was going to go to my grave, not knowing Diane's sister, Victoria, would tearfully say years later. Investigators did not forget about Diane's case and tried to use new technology to solve it as it became available to them. Scrapings from under Diane's fingernails had been preserved, and in late 2000, they were tested in hopes of developing a DNA profile of Diane's killer. A profile was developed, but when it was uploaded to criminal database, no match was found. A hair follicle had also been found in Diane's hand, and a new technology was used to process it in the summer of 2010. However, when a DNA profile was developed, there was still no match to it in any database. Authorities then turned to genetic genealogy as a possible avenue for finally solving the case in May of 2020. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department utilized genealogy databases that give users the option of making their DNA profiles available for comparison to law enforcement. Close relatives of the killer were not in the database, which meant the process was very labor-intensive for investigators as they created family trees of his more distant relatives, trying to identify him. Investigators contacted numerous individuals they believed to be distantly related to the killer, asking for information about their family related to the killer, asking for information about their family histories, and ultimately constructed 9 family trees containing over 1,300 people related to the killer, either by blood or marriage. The massive and detailed effort did eventually identify a potential suspect, but he had passed away since the murder. His children agreed to provide samples of their DNA. Testing on these samples confirmed that their father was the individual whose DNA was found under Diane's nails and in her hand. On March 16, 2022, authorities announced the identity of the suspect, Warren Robertson. Robertson, along with his wife and several other relatives, had lived in the same apartment complex as Diane in 1988. Authorities have not been able to determine if he and Diane knew each other prior to the murder. They both enjoyed racing and attended local stock car races at the nearby El Cajon Speedway. Robertson was never a suspect in the case prior to his DNA being matched to the DNA from the crime scene, thanks to genetic genealogy. He was not mentioned in any reports from the initial investigation, and he does not appear to have been questioned in the initial canvassing of the apartment complex in 1988. Robertson was a native of Arkansas. He worked as a tow truck driver at the time of Diane's murder. He did have a criminal record, but only for low-level property crimes, not for any other violent offenses. Robertson and his family moved away from the apartment complex shortly after Diane was killed to Lakeside, California. They then moved again the following year, this time to Indiana. Robertson died in a house fire there in 1999 at the age of 39. At the press conference announcing Robertson's identification, Diane's sister recounted memories of her beloved sister and thanked members of law enforcement for never giving up on the case. She said that the day she learned a suspect had finally been identified was the best day of her life, aside from the days her children were born. Diane's now adult son, Mark, provided a video statement played at the press conference. While he was too young at the time of her death to have many strong memories of his mother, he stated that everyone who had ever spoken to him about his mother told him how good of a person she was. He likes to think he inherited those positive traits from her and tries to be a good person, to be like his mother. The answers that my family received, it's closure. And closure is everything, even after so much time has passed, Mark said in the video. And now I have a story to tell the world and tell people who cross my path. In 2007, 18-year-old Anita Knudsen was a freshman at Minot State University in North Dakota, where she was studying elementary education. In addition to attending classes, she also worked at a local hotel and was making a variety of new friends in her new city. While she had left her family home in Butte, North Dakota, approximately an hour's drive from Minot, to attend school, she remained very close with her family and was in regular contact with them. According to Anita's younger sister Anna, Anita could make whoever she was speaking to feel as though they were the most important person in the world. Over the first weekend in June of 2007, Anna was at the North Dakota State baseball tournament with her father to watch her brother Daniel play. While at the tournament, Anna and her father realized that neither they nor Anita's mother had heard from Anita all weekend, which was strange. They had all tried calling Anita as usual, but they realized that she had returned no one's calls. Anita's family grew even more concerned when they learned she had not reported to work on Saturday, June 2nd, which was unheard of for Anita, who was responsible in all things, including her job. Anita's worried father, Gordon, therefore, drove to Minot that Monday, June 4, 2007, to check on his daughter at her apartment. He saw Anita's car parked outside, but she did not answer the door when he knocked on it. The door was locked, so Gordon walked around to his daughter's bedroom window. The window was open, and the screen was missing. Looking through the open window, Gordon could see Anita lying on her bed. He reached out to her through the window but found that she was cold when he touched her. Gordon then rushed to find Anita's landlord, and he was ultimately able to convince her to open the door to the apartment using her copy of the key. When he finally got inside and to Anita, he confirmed that his daughter was dead. Anita had been stabbed twice in the chest. A pocket knife with dried blood on it was found in the apartment. Some reports state that the knife was found in a bathroom sink, but a later affidavit of probable cause states that it was found on Anita's bed. Anita's valuables, including cash, her laptop, digital camera, and cell phone, were all still in the apartment. Examination of her body found no signs of sexual assault. Anita's time of death was placed in the early morning hours of Sunday, June 3rd. Analysis of Anita's phone showed that she'd been texting a friend just before 5 a.m. The friend sent Anita a text message at 4:43 a.m., and Anita responded to it at 4:48. The friend sent another text at 4:53. According to cell phone records, Anita never read that text message, and she made no further communications using the phone. This raised a lot of questions about Anita's whereabouts on Saturday and why she had abruptly stopped speaking to her family and inexplicably skipped her shift at work. Investigators interviewed numerous individuals, some of whom knew Anita and some of whom had connections to the area where she lived but could not locate enough evidence to make an arrest in the case. Billboards were put up throughout the area asking for tips but did not result in critical information being reported. Years passed and the case went cold. Anita's death was devastating for her family. Her brother, Daniel, in particular, struggled with Anita's death and was never the same after her murder. He took his own life in April of 2013 at the age of 22. What haunts me the most about the death of my sister is that whoever killed her also took the life of my brother that very day. After she was killed, he was never the same. I just don't think this person or monster knew the pain he would cause our family and friends. Anita's sister Anna would later tell Dateline. It would be nearly 15 years before a suspect was charged in Anita's case. On March 16, 2022, Minot Police Chief John Klug announced at a press conference that an arrest had been made in the case that afternoon. At 3:25 p.m., 34-year-old Nicole Rice had been taken into custody without incident at Minot Air Force Base, where she was employed in a civilian position. She was being charged with murder in connection to Anita's death. Chief Klug attributed the new momentum in the case to the television show Cold Justice, which had recently come to Minot to look into Anita's murder. The program follows former prosecutor Kelly Siegler as she brings investigators to police departments around the country to assist them with their chief. Klug said at the press conference, "Although most of the detectives who worked the original scene and investigation have retired, we had not forgotten about this case. We tried to actively investigate Anita's case for the past few years, and finally, with the help of Cold Justice, we were able to move forward and regain focus. Due to the resources, logistics, planning, and experts they were able to provide, we were able to obtain an arrest warrant." Nicole Rice had gotten married in the years since Anita was murdered. In 2007, she was still using her maiden name of Thomas. She was also Anita's roommate. This had made her a person of interest from the early days of the investigation, but authorities did not have enough evidence to charge her. According to Chief Klug, only a few new details had come to light during the more recent investigation, and the arrest was made largely due to a detailed examination of the facts of the case and the information already available to investigators. Chief Klug did not disclose the evidence against Nicole Rice at the press conference, but some of it was detailed in the affidavit of probable cause filed on the day of her arrest. A major detail that had pointed to Nicole's involvement in the case from the very beginning was the fact that the door to the apartment she shared with Anita was locked when Anita's father discovered her body. The lock on the front door was a type that had to be both unlocked and locked with a key. There was no way for someone to lock the door without using a key. Anita, Nicole, their landlord, and a maintenance worker were the only people who had keys. Anita's key was still with her belongings inside, and the other 3 individuals were investigated. The screen to the window in Anita's bedroom had been slashed and then removed from the window, which was left open. This allowed Anita's father to be able to reach inside the apartment and touch Anita's body when he came to check on her. However, while the screen may have been removed and the window left open to make it appear as though someone had entered and left the apartment through the window rather than the door, evidence inside Anita's room showed that this was not the case. 2 fabric bins overflowing with items were located right below the window and had not been disturbed. There were no shoe prints or scuff marks near the window. Dust and cobwebs in the window were not disturbed, and the aluminum seam of the window showed no signs of it being bent under someone's weight. Nicole and Anita were roommates, but they did not get along. According to the affidavit, friends characterized Anita as kind, friendly, and likable, whereas they described Nicole as hot-tempered and reactionary. This led to tension between the roommates. Nicole told police after Anita was killed that she and Anita were best friends and that she had never complained about Anita to anyone. Numerous witnesses contradicted these statements. Furthermore, a friend reported that shortly before the murder, they heard Nicole tell Anita, "One way or another, I'm going to get you out of this house." Nicole was not home when Anita's body was found, and she told police that she had an alibi for the time of the murder. She claimed to have been at her family's farm since 7 p.m. on the night of Saturday, June 2nd. However, a witness reported being with Nicole in a bar in Rousseau on the evening of June 2nd into the early morning hours of June 3rd. As they were leaving the bar, Nicole told the witness that she was going back to her apartment in Minot to get some clothes. Following the murder, Nicole gave this witness several different stories and described Anita in derogatory terms using foul language. The same witness reported that Nicole told her details about the crime scene. These details should not have been known to Nicole. Nicole and her father have given accounts in which they both claim Nicole was at the farm from 7 p.m. on June 2nd onward. However, according to the affidavit in their various statements to investigators, their various stories have changed and have been inconsistent and contradictory of each other, although the affidavit does not go into detail about these inconsistencies and contradictions. Investigators had long been aware of rumors that Nicole had admitted to the murder to someone, but they were not aware of who had heard the admission firsthand. In March of 2022, they identified that individual as William May. William had dated Nicole for several months in either 2008 or 2009. According to William, Nicole had attended a house party thrown by him and his roommates. Anita's murder came up, and some people began discussing theories about who the murderer could be. In response, Nicole became what William described as belligerently drunk. When they were going to bed, Nicole told William that she did it. He tried to get her to admit to the murder in more detail later when she was sober, but she would just become angry at the mention of the crime. Nicole Rice's first court appearance was made on March 17th, with Nicole appearing via video call from the Ward County Detention Center. The state argued that her bond should be set at $1 million, and her defense argued that such a high amount was not necessary because she was not of light risk. The judge ultimately set her bond at $120,000 cash or $250,000 surety. She was able to post it by that evening. Nicole Rice is next due in court on April 21st for her preliminary hearing and arraignment. If convicted of the charges against her, she could be sentenced to life in prison without parole. Summer of 1992 was a difficult time for Nona Cobb. The 29-year-old was a widow and had lost custody of her 3-year-old son, Josh, 7 months earlier. Nona's sister, Becky, and her husband had custody of the little boy. Nona loved her son very much and was very proud of him. She called her sister every day to check in on Josh. Nona was struggling with a drug problem. While her family did not support her drug use, they still loved her. She loved us and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her, her sister Vicky would later tell the Winston-Salem Journal. Nona was last seen alive on the night of July 6, 1992. She was seen getting into a truck with a man at the Welcome Center on Interstate 85 in Cleveland County, North Carolina, south of Kings Mountain. Her body would be discovered at 6:15 the following morning along the northbound side of Interstate 77 in Surry County, North Carolina. She had been strangled. There were few early leads in Nona's case. The first major suspect for her murder was identified in 1995. Sean Patrick Goebel was a truck driver from Asheboro, North Carolina, and was questioned about Nona's murder after a fingerprint tied him to another killing. He denied any involvement in Nona's case. Later that year, police were able to eliminate him as a suspect in Nona's murder based on DNA evidence collected from her body. Goebbels was later convicted of killing 3 other women and is currently serving 2 life sentences plus 14 years in prison. Years later, it would be that same DNA evidence that would lead to investigators finally being able to make an arrest in Nona's case. In April of 2021, special agents from the State Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Investigation Unit and investigators from the Surry County Sheriff's Office began re-examining the physical evidence in the case. Still unable to find a match to the DNA from Nona's body, they began working with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the founder of Identifiers International. This effort ultimately led to the identification of a suspect in the case. On March 15, 2022, almost 30 years after Nona was killed, 71-year-old Warren Luther Alexander was arrested in Diamond Head, Mississippi, and charged with her murder. He is currently being held at the Hancock County Jail, awaiting his extradition to North Carolina to face the charges. The investigation is ongoing, and authorities are not releasing any further information at this time. They are also investigating the possibility that Alexander is also responsible for other murders. It was in 1973 when 23-year-old Althea Dale Blankenship and her 4-year-old son, Jeffrey, moved to Port Townsend close to the Puget Sound in Washington. Althea had spent her early life in Virginia before moving to Washington with her family. She graduated from Shoreline High School, Washington in 1967, and 2 years later her son Jeffrey was born. Althea had set her sights on creating a better life for the pair. Contemporary news articles do not mention whether Jeffrey's father was in the picture, and it appears he has never been named publicly. After spending a few years in Shoreline, Althea decided to move 50 miles to Port Townsend, Washington. Althea's parents, Oscar and Mary Marks, owned a home in Port Townsend, and she wanted herself and her son to be closer to her parents. The move was a breath of fresh air for the two, and they rented a room from Glenn Allen Bagley. According to local news reports, Althea and Glenn developed a romantic interest in one another. Unfortunately, little is known about Althea's time in Port Townsend. We do know that at the time, Glenn Bagley was separated from his wife Esther Mae Jessler. Just 3 years after Althea and Jeffrey were last seen, Esther too would disappear. She was last seen in Auburn, Washington on March 13, 1976, leaving home in her blue Mercury station wagon. By 1976, Esther had remarried and was training to become a paralegal. On the day that Esther disappeared, she told her second husband that she was going to rent a hotel room so she could be alone to study. While the disappearance of Esther and Althea have never been officially connected, it is hard to ignore the striking similarities. Althea and her son Jeffrey were last seen on March 27, 1973, at or close to the apartment that they shared with Glenn Bagley. That day, Althea and Jeffrey were due to travel to the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. From there, they had plans to fly to New York City and catch a connecting flight to Greece to meet up with Althea's parents, who were already holidaying there. Unfortunately, Althea and Jeffrey never made it to their flights and have never been seen or heard from again. Glenn is believed to be the last person to have seen the pair alive. He told the Kent Police Department that on March 27th, he dropped Althea and Jeffrey off at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, which was the last time he saw them. Investigators doubted his story, but without solid evidence, they were unable to move forward with a conviction. While searching Althea's room, they uncovered letters between the two that exposed their romantic relationship, which had previously been unknown. Following the 1976 disappearance of Esther, authorities ramped up their investigation of him. Glenn soon caught wind of the police attention that he'd garnered and had moved to the Philippines to escape the heat. Glenn Allen Bagley never returned to the United States, passing away in 2016 from cancer. According to the Charlie Project, the Kent Police Department tried to build a case against him for many years, but were always unsuccessful. An ex-girlfriend at Bagley later told investigators that he had not been building a cat house on the day of Esther's disappearance as he had told law enforcement. She refused to tell the police anything else as Glenn had threatened her, telling her, quote, "You will end up in the same culvert in Kinsang as Esther." Searches for Althea, Jeffrey, and Esther have been conducted, but nothing has been found so far. In 1973, burned and charred human remains were discovered on Protection Island just off of Discovery Bay. Unfortunately, the chain of custody is somewhat murky on these remains, with the Port Townsend leader reporting, quote, "The remains pulled from the island burn pile in 1973 were transferred to the University of Washington's anthropology lab. It was concluded that the University of Washington had no documentation of those remains nor several other associated records from that era." Althea Dale Blankenship is described as a Caucasian female with brown hair, blue eyes, 5'7", and a 135 to a pound 140. Jeffrey Dean Blankenship was described as a white male with brown hair, brown eyes, 3'5" and a pound 75. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective John Thompson of the Kent Police Department. It was on September 29, 1980, approximately 5 miles from Ashland, Virginia at around 6:30 p.m. when firefighters were attempting to put out a brush fire when they came across the burned remains of a young woman. She was found on a gravel dirt road that would be later named Wesley's Court, just off of what is now Greenwood Church Road, approximately 12 minutes outside of Ashland. The woman was able to be identified quickly through dental records. She was Patricia Eve Gegler. Not much is known about the young woman, but she was 28 years old. She was moving from her hometown in Pottstown, Pennsylvania to live with her brother in Richmond, Virginia. Authorities would discover that she had last been seen on September 29th around 3 p.m. at a Sunoco gas station in Ashland, Virginia. News reports from 1980 stated that she'd been there to get a used car tire. They would also discover her vehicle on the dirt road near the fire. An autopsy was performed and the medical examiner stated that Patricia had died from an upper airways burns due to immolation or death by fire. They said that she had most likely died within seconds of her airways being burned. They also stated that they didn't find any other wounds on her body, as well as no evidence of sexual assault. They could not determine if she had been conscious at the time of her death, and her death was ultimately ruled a homicide. There has been no speculation if the killer had started the fire or it had already been started and just utilized. No suspect has ever been reported to the public. There's no record that Patricia had been married at any point in her life. Her last known occupation had been stated as a waitress on her death certificate. Both of her parents passed away in 2010 and 2012, and they never got to know what happened to their daughter. Patricia was last seen at that gas station, and she'd only been about 30 minutes from Richmond, Virginia. Law enforcement has always been stumped on why she'd been on that road going in the wrong direction when she was last seen on the main road to Richmond. Authorities have never released much about this case, and details for this are significantly lacking. In January 2022, deputies from the Hanover County Sheriff's Department asked the public to come forward with any information regarding the case of Patricia Eve Gegler. 30-year-old Sheila Sue Connor was described as a loving and caring mother to her 8-year-old son, David. Sheila's life hadn't always been easy, with her son telling local news outlets that she'd been subjected to violence from a young age. Despite her challenging beginnings, Sheila was a kind and gentle soul who ensured her son would never have to face the same hardships she did. The two lived together in Houston, Texas, and things were going well for a while. That was until December 31st, 1991. David's only memory of that day was being pulled out of the bath and being told to dry off and put on some clothes as quickly as possible. Houston police officers crouched to his level and told him the devastating news. His beloved mother was missing. At 8 years old, this was hard for David to comprehend, and it took several years for him to be able to process that day entirely. According to reports, Sheila was last seen at Echo Glen Lane at the home of her boyfriend. The man with whom Sheila was in a relationship was much older than her, and her friends and family worried for her safety. Sheila was considerably more vulnerable as she was battling with addiction at the time of her disappearance. The last known contact from Sheila Connor came at 3:30 a.m. when she called a friend from her boyfriend's home in North Houston. She told a friend that she and him had gotten into an argument, and that was the last time anyone ever heard from Sheila. She was reported missing days later. When her missing person investigation began, her car was found abandoned and stripped down along Interstate 45 in New Haven, Texas. Sheila's boyfriend has never been publicly named, but David Connor believes his mother was murdered that night. David now works with the media to ensure his mother's name and story has never been forgotten. Sheila Sue Connor is described as a white female with brown hair, brown eyes, 5 foot, and pound 130. She has a scar on the right side of her chin and the following tattoos: a leaf on her left leg, a rose on her right breast, and a tattoo on her arm. She was last seen wearing a black jacket, blue jeans, and maybe wearing glasses. Her son is still hopeful that someone with information will come forward and he can finally have some answers. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.